Welcome to episode 13 of the Liminal Space podcast. This is Tristan.
This is Rashid.
Today we have Leila speaking with us. And we met Leila, both of us met Leila at the same time at an event called Urban Dialogues, which
you hosted.
Co-hosted.
Okay, co-hosted.
Co-hosted with Barry Lewis, who was on the podcast before. And we met at their venue in Philippi, or as you say.
Philippi.
Yeah.
Bro.
And we were having conversations about the city of Cape Town, the apartheid nature of it, and how different people in the city experience the city. I think Leila was in a group with you.
Yeah, because part of the Urban Dialogues, which you guys set up so beautifully, was we had these small groups, 3 or 4 of us around the table. And I was in a group with Leila, which was very cool. And honestly, on my side, I was just like, this is a cool human. She's a vibe. And yeah, I was just quite inspired by the way she views the world and the city and everything in it. And yeah, we thought it would be so cool to have her as a guest and have cool conversations with her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we also found further overlap with an episode or so ago. We interviewed Bongeka and Apiwe, and they are friends with Leila as well.
Exactly.
So we thought that's a cool connection.
Yeah.
And we should probably chat.
Yeah. Leila Kidson is a social systems researcher, facilitator, and designer focused on better integrating grassroots voices into systems design, advocacy, and action. As co-founder of social design studio OCTOPI, she blends storytelling, co-creation, strategy, and intersectional feminist practice to drive radical transformation in civic freedoms, solidarity economics, and social justice. She appreciates sitting around a lunch table with interesting people and free diving in kelp forests. So welcome, Leila.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for
really
having me.
excited to- yeah.
So nice to have you here. We are recording from Woodstock today in your studio. I think that's what you call it. I call it the OCTOPI studio, which is the wrong way to say it.
OCTOPI.
But maybe tell us a bit about what happens in the space that you have.
Sure. OCTOPI, as you mentioned, is a social design studio, and we've run for about 5 years working with different grassroots to global organizations. And Cara and I started it. We're best friends and we wanted to do something more. And working online has been great, but lonely. And a big part of what we care about is motivating collective action and solidarity and community. And so we, I think a year ago, decided to rent a space and have a long table and have a space that people could come to, that we could invite, that became a space that can catalyze more action. And that's what it's been for the last year, and it's been wonderful. We've had so many interesting people come into the space, and we share, the studio sits inside a broader building that has artists and creatives and designers and a listening room downstairs and a yoga studio and just very interesting people. And I just really love Woodstock, so it's been really nice to feel part of it. And it's walking distance from my house, which is like one of the biggest joys of my day, is getting to walk the Woodstock main road.
Nice. Yeah. You stay in OBS.
Stay in OBS, yeah.
Very cool.
Woodstock Main Road is an exciting road to walk because there's all sorts happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful.
Brilliant. So Leila, when we start our podcast, we usually ask this question that's a general one and that you can answer in whichever way you feel like you want to. Is there a story or a couple of stories that you feel grounds you or helps you make sense of the world currently?
There isn't necessarily a particular story, like linear story, but there's kind of a sense that grounds me, that I think I hold as a necessity. I hold hope that I believe every human being is good at their core. And I think that's something that I find gives me the motivation to keep doing whatever it is, because I think that the kind of orientation towards despair or towards a belief in evil puts a very particular lens on how we see the world. And I think that has kind of evolved in different ways throughout my life, and I'm very lucky to have felt so much love in different ways in my life. It's a very big part of it. Family, friends, close connection. So I think the like story or sense or feeling that grounds me is a belief in this wonderful nature and capacity of humans, and a belief that that is something that I want to hold on to, because if I believe that, then everything I do will try motivate towards that and will orient me towards doing that more and like moving away from things that aren't that for myself and behaviors that are that in myself as they are potentially in others. And I'm very lucky that I also have like a family that have a very heartfelt and hopeful way of being that also grounds me a lot and is kind of simple in a way.
That's beautiful.
Where do you think that comes from? When did you start believing that? Because that is a story, the story about every human having at least the capacity to be good, but you're saying even this, it sounds like this innate goodness within them. For you, where does that start? When did you first come to that?
I think I found the language for it from a book called Humankind by, I'm not going to get his name right, but by a guy who wrote a book called Humankind, and it was kind of around understanding, reflecting on history and all of the points at which we have determined that humans, if put in a particular context, are going to be bad, or not even put in a particular context, but that like the Stanford prison experiment was this example of how humans are inherently bad, but when you look at it, actually all of the design of that test set up people to be bad. It wasn't that inherently that's what they would do. So that gave me the language for all of the ways that we have crafted our idea of people as evil, as like designed. Our narratives are designed in the world, and the narratives that we hold closer to ourselves determine the behavior we have in the world. So that gave me the language of, if we hold that narrative at our core that people are bad, then we're going to act in a bad way, or we're going to treat others in a bad way. And I think before I had the language for it, there was maybe a little bit of like, I had troublesome mental health as a teenager, and like, if I'm going to believe that I want to keep living in the world, I've got to believe that something's worth living for. And that's got to be that the world outside me is worth living for. And I think further back from that, my mum is a source of absolute joy. She sees so much beauty in things. She sees so much joy. She's like, put a good meal in front of her and she's the happiest person you've ever seen, or like a good swim in the sea. And so I think seeing that and knowing that's possible is a really inspiring part of being able to hold that as a core.
That's cool. That is also one of my like core beliefs, that all humans are inherently good. Just for interest, Justin, do you also share that? Because I know not everyone does. I've sometimes had some debates with people about it.
I'm unsure.
Okay.
I think I would say, I think I believe for now that all human beings have the capacity for good and evil. So maybe in some ways it's true. There is an innate goodness if you have the capacity to do that.
Must be.
But what I'm finding interesting in that, if like for that as a starting point, like if that's like a thing that you look out into the world as, it's interesting for that kind of conversation at this point in the world where there's a lot of like demonizing of one or the other. So if you're in one camp, your focus is almost completely on annihilating the other. Obviously, I do believe that there are objectively things that are wrong and bad and evil,
course, yeah.
But there's a different thing when we are demonizing other people. So maybe that's a question in like the work that you do. How do you make sense of that? That like some of the groups and people you're working with are trying to make the world a better place. And often they would identify who the enemy is, air quotes, enemy, or who's the person doing something to them. How do you incorporate that into your work? Okay, there are things to be made right, and there are people doing bad things, but also those people have innate goodness in them.
The first thing I think about, which is kind of maybe a more broad comment, is that my belief in and hope that people are good isn't contrary to a belief I hold that we're also inherently in many ways violent. I think nature is violent, animals are violent, mammals are violent. Violence is still a kind of a part of the human and mammalian and earth existence. And what motivates that violence exists at the different like phases of survival or belonging or understanding of all these kind of evolutionary things that we hold close to ourselves. Like if my survival is determined on whether I need to enact violence on someone else, then that is still a violence that might still be to protect my people. And I would hope we move beyond that in our kind of consciousness as a people, because that feels like something we're capable of doing. Maybe we just need a few more millennia to get there if we last that long. But something that we're currently working with the Schumacher Center for New Economics, who are an incredible group in the US. And Susan, who we're working with there, said something recently that I'm going to mix up the quote on, but she said something on, if our orientation is to criticize, then we build people's capacity to criticize. If our orientation is to imagine and build, then people are going to have the capacity to imagine and build, and that's going to be their orientation. And I think that quote from her inspires me to look at how much in politics at the moment we orient towards criticism and don't often orient towards gathering and forming like action-oriented behavior. And actually for myself, that kind of focus on collective action and OCTOPI, that's kind of a similar thing that we're trying to focus on, is how do you motivate collective action towards a future that we want to focus on. And I think that holding that helps me a little bit, because we can see what we don't want to do, and that's fine, and that allows us to be like critical of something. But to be able to have the kind of radical imagination to show up and go, okay, if I believe that humans have the capacity for good and are good, then what could we do together? What could life look like differently together? And how do we mobilize towards that? Because I think it's a pretty big critique I have of the left, and that so much of it is criticism, that moves so many people towards the right. And that's a pretty damaging and scary thing, that you're watching so many people move kind of left to center to right, because there's a better sense of belonging in the right than there is in the left. And that's kind of a human nature to want a sense of belonging. Yeah. I don't know if that
it's
answered.
almost, it's an interesting thing, because I'm also convinced about this. Like, we've exercised the muscle of critique so much, like in our institutions, academic institutions, in everywhere we go, really, like on especially leftist spaces, where some of our people are, like, we can critique very well actually and do a very good job. But like that next step, which I think some of what we're trying to do on the podcast is like talk about that next, okay, but let's imagine something new. But something that's fresh that you are saying is like, it's almost like that very thing that makes us human, the idea of belonging, is what is needed to be human. We still need that as human. We still are human. We're not machines trying to change systems. We are human beings trying to do stuff and live in this world at the same time, you know?
I think part of, I like to talk about the new earth or a new world, the future that we're trying to reinvent or imagine. I think part of what that future would look like would be belonging. And, you know, probably, it sounds very airy-fairy, but probably like belonging of all humanity and nature together and everything like that. But I think perhaps because some of the spaces that you're talking about, you name them as left spaces or whatever they are, because they don't have that reimagination towards action, which would dream about a better world and, you know, world with better systems and better ways. But because that's not there, or not enough of that is there, it's like, okay, well, belonging will also be part of that future. So let's belong in cults or, you know what I mean, crazy white supremacist organizations or stuff like that. I always think about that. Like, I always think about, even in our context, about how gangsterism, it's a symptom of a lack of belonging and identity and those kind of things, you know. It's not helpful or not healthy, but it's almost like then we actually need to imagine more spaces where people can belong and be, you know.
That was we did some work in an area in Joburg called Makers Valley, which is like just east of the CBD. Troyville, Bertram's, Judith Parle, group of kind of little small suburbs last year. And we ran focus groups and interviews and conversations with about 50 different community members. And it's a pretty low socioeconomic space. And it was so interesting. There were so many different programs that were running, and so much of the conversation that came up was like, if we have the opportunity to be in a group towards something that we think is good, that gives us the opportunity to not be on a route towards gangsterism. It was a lot of the narrative that we got out of it. And just thinking about how much the way that the kind of economic system is designed and the current systems are designed are very fragmenting. They're very individualizing. And so you kind of end up in your small little cubicle in the workspace that you're in, where HR is telling you you've got to be really close in community because you have like a lunch once a month. And you start to feel so much less agency, I feel like, because you have less of the kind of social fabric that gets you closer to being able to be like, okay, we're already connected, let's mobilize, let's do this thing, let's start something together. And I think that makes me think, that scares me. That scares me to be sitting in a world where, when the stuff that is happening across the world is so terrifying, and you're looking at America and the fall of an empire in some way, and the rise of oligarchy to such an extreme, that when I look at that and I think of how fragmented and weak our community capacity is and what we belong in, which is what you were kind of speaking to, it does make me kind of want to really look at how we reimagine being able to belong more and what we're belonging to. And I think that's also kind of interesting. This is a bit of a segue, but the way that religion exists as a space of belonging is a really powerful tool. And I don't belong to any religion, and it's almost something that I feel every now and then that I've missed out on, because there are rituals of belonging, and some of those rituals can be kind of violent, and some of the inactions of religion are quite violent. But there is also some like a gathering capacity that exists. I think you can see that in Cape Town so much in the Muslim community, in gathering around Palestinian stuff, that there's a organizing capacity that doesn't really exist in what I would say is a middle class Cape Townian kind of grouping.
So what do you believe about religion, or what is your personal belief about, let's call it like a higher power or something out of body? I don't know what to call it.
And maybe those are two different questions. Religion and a higher power. Is it even the same thing? I'm being naughty.
I don't know.
I wasn't raised with any religion. Both my parents are pretty agnostic / atheist. Although I don't actually believe that my dad is atheist. I think he does believe in magic in some kind of way, or like a belief that there are more beautiful things in the world. And I think a lot of atheism is actually being like, I refuse to believe in the doctrine of religion more than like I refuse to believe that there's something magical in the world that guides this. So I was raised without any religion. I had influence of Baha'i when I was a kid, which was really, really wonderful. And it's a religion if I was told I had to believe in something, I'd be like, cool,
Where did that influence come in, just for interest sake?
My younger brother had a best friend in like preschool, and his family were Baha'i.
Wow.
So yeah, was raised with the capacity. I was allowed to go to church, to whatever I wanted to go to, and learn about it. Practiced Ramadan when I was like 12 or something, because I could. And I've always kind of believed in, I don't know if I would say like angels. Maybe that's just like a language that was used because part of the family are Christian, on the broader family. But always believed that like something guides the world. And I think I summarize that down into science of some sort, that I was like, energy is eternal, and if energy is eternal, that's always going to feed back into the world, and that's kind of beautiful. And trees become people, and people decompose, and people become fishes, and whatever. And kind of clichely, I just like look at the light at golden hour, and I'm like, something has to exist that's too pretty to just be science. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I think I have a spiritual orientation that helps me kind of be like, humans are beautiful, and humans connecting is beautiful, and nature is beautiful, and all of that beauty is allowed to mean something more, and I'm okay to not know what that thing is, because to not know is actually a pretty big motivation in being in the world, because it gives you more to be curious about and ask questions of and have conversations of. It's that idea of mystery, like the mystery is good. You reminded me of a conversation I had with an academic, and they were talking about how in progressive circles within academia even, often what's forgotten is that very like, again, the human thing, which is like actually like religious systems, let's call them religious systems, are part of people's lives. This is like stuff that people, you go to church, or you go to mosque, or you
there are certain things that you do, and we can't pretend that like those things don't exist for ordinary people. It just is part of how we navigate the world and make sense of it and be human, you know. And I just feel like we ignore that at our own peril. Like it just
Yeah, and those stories about religion or about God or about angels or whatever, I have a friend who talks about meta-narratives, and he's like, those are actually meta-narratives for people's lives, for social fabric, for everything like that, which is why it's very important to talk about them, and also perhaps to make connections between, I was thinking about some of the things you were talking about earlier about the capacity for goodness in humans, and then also like the capacity for violence. So then I'm interested in some questions around how does, I'll say religious belief system, but it could be a spiritual belief system or something like that. How does that actually influence that capacity for goodness or the capacity for violence? So maybe I'll give an example. Whenever we talk about Christianity, we have to give a trigger warning. You do that on the thing,
yes.
but naughty. But I'll just give an example. Like, so in Christianity, at least in a certain expression of Christianity, there's this fundamental belief in like all humans are sinful. And I've actually heard, just for example, some people look at that story and actually retell it in a different way, which actually says, no, not all humans are born into sin or whatever stuff like that. But actually that the original image that humans were created in is the image of goodness. Like, we don't need to obviously go into that, but the story Adam and Eve with the tree and the fruit and everything like that. But it says, no, God created humanity, Adama, and then God said, all of creation, this is good. Humans, this is very good. So that's actually an original image of goodness. And actually using, for example, scripture to be like, no, that story, we need to interrogate that story and actually retell it, which is probably where when I mentioned earlier that I believe in the inherent goodness of everyone, it kind of comes from there. So maybe thinking about, for either of you, maybe some other examples where religion, it either enacts violence or it enacts goodness and peace and love. Because I think religions often talk about things like peace and love, but then you dig a little bit behind the layers, and often it's like, no, peace and love for us and our people. But everyone else, all the other humans who exist, you become demonized or dehumanized. So yeah, just maybe thinking of that as well.
It's kind of like the vehicle of religion can be used in so many different ways. And I think of like I come from studying law, and when you study law, you speak about the word of the law or the spirit of the law. And if I am reading the word of the law, I'm like, exactly what that says is what we have to believe and what we have to follow. Or if you're dealing with the spirit of the law, you're like, what is the intention behind the thing that is being said? And I think that a lot of the way that religion or the doctrine of religion exists is it is just like narratives or stories that are meant to bind and create some kind of guiding force towards how you should be existing in the world based on some belief systems. I think a lot of religions have super, super patriarchal roots. So like I think that a lot of that doctrine is pretty tricksy and like is going to motivate different kinds of use of power. But I think that it's quite beautiful if you can exist within a religion and understand that the doctrine is to be interpreted towards kind of core principles or values that you want to hold, that they exist as stories that give you more diversity of ways that you could be doing things. But I think that a really horrible thing that like kind of my biggest reason I think I don't know if I would ever really join religion is I think religion, as you said, is kind of a mechanism for othering, and it is like, I believe in this and you believe in that, we're so different, despite the fact that the spirit maybe of both of those things, the spirit of the words behind it, are kind of the same thing. They're just different rule sets or ways of getting to that. So yeah, I think it's like when I was younger, I remember so often I would like tell some kid that I didn't believe in God, and they'd be like, you're evil and you're going to go to hell, and you don't, how do you even know what to do good? Like, how are you going to like follow like a good life? And I was like, because my parents raised me well, like because they've told me how to be nice to people, like because I can model behavior, like it doesn't have to be strict kind of guardrails. And I think that is a kind of funny thing that we think that I think that there is a belief that a lot of religion motivates, where you think that, no, because I follow my religion, I am going to be good, I'm going to be absolved, or whatever it is, compared to actually, no, inherently in my being, I should be doing this because I should be doing this because it's good at my heart, instead of because it's good in relation to this scripture.
I think what's important, at least what's been important for me in my journey to add to that, is that everyone is just as human as me. And that's also probably like a fundamental belief similar to the inherent goodness of everyone. It's like this person who disagrees with me, who has different perspectives as me, they're just as human as I am. And maybe we need to sit around the table. I like what you said in your bio, sitting around the table. Maybe also doing that with people who have complete different opinions and stuff, and being like, yeah, you're just as human as me. Maybe you grew up in a different way and you were socialized in a different way, and that's actually that's why I'm dehumanizing you, because of your socialization. But the reality with socialization is we can all be re-socialized away from harmful things and into better things, you know.
Like many people in different religions are. Like there's so much, like I can speak about the negatives, but there's so many positives. There's so many experiences I've had in my life of people from different religions being like, oh yeah, no, well, of course we accept you, you're human. And that's a big experience as well.
That's cool. It's again that process that I love about maybe firstly acknowledging and naming certain stories and underlying narratives, interrogating them, rejecting them where they need to be rejected, because I think many do need to be rejected, and rewriting new stories and telling new narratives. And I think part of that rewriting of stories, it has to also be a collective thing. It can't be me and myself with my own opinions and my own socialization. No, we need to actually do that together, you know.
I think about that as like the new social contract. Kumi Naidoo speaks about it in that like framing. And it's quite a nice thing. I like it, obviously, because it's got a contract and that there's something to me in like a legal mind that I'm like, that's nice. But I've been wanting to do it for so long, of like have sessions and series of people around table just designing a new social contract. If we were to have a clause about food systems, what would it look like? If we would have an act around this, what would it look like? What do you want in a like really functional way to be possible? How do you want the outside of your street to look like? What do you want? Like all of those kind of things of like, we exist within a social contract currently, but we're not really defining it. And as the average person, and what does that mean if we actually were to write a new social contract? What would that look like for us?
My coaching question would be, why are you not doing that? What's stopping you from doing? You should do that.
It's on the list. It's like the third one or fourth one on the list.
I'm wondering now about something a bit different than this thread we're going on, but it's kind of related to the story, the framework, Rashid, you use about retelling a story. And obviously, Leila, I'm going to make assumptions about you now. Some of them are not assumptions because I know. But you're like kind of middle class white person in Cape Town, and you navigate the city with that identity and other things as well that's added to your identity. But I wondered about what you make of like your whiteness in Cape Town. I think in your bio, you specifically talk about an intersectional feminist practice. So I wondered about that, like your whiteness and the feminist praxis, what that actually means for yourself, like how you navigate the city, and maybe for your work as well.
Yeah, I grew up in Somerset West, and Somerset West then is just like so white, it's painful. And it's like maybe 10 to 20% of my year of 230 something people were black or colored, So my like orientation around even just hearing stories different to my own was so infrequent. And my capacity to believe that there were stories that were so drastically different. And I think I went on some leadership camps or something at age 13 or 14 and started making friends particularly across class divides, which I think was really valuable for me. And that happened to also be across race divides, because that's how Cape Town's set up.
Yeah.
I like think of that moment so clearly because I was then on Mixit with those people and like hearing about their friend who was killed in a taxi accident. And how much just like having stories different to my own became this like infusion into myself that changed the way that I oriented or empathized or understood. And then going to Rhodes University was again like I was then now a minority in a space that had many other stories being told and very involved in protest space in that time. And also then like starting to be able to hear more stories. And there are always stories being told and there are always people who could be listening. But actually there's like a middle point of the capacity to actually hear and understand a story that's being told on the other side that I think is something that like so many white South Africans lack. And so many people in spaces of privilege lack. Like whatever divide it is that moves you outside of something. Moves you out of kind of like a listening capacity. You either kind of mold it into what you believe the narrative is because you actually just don't understand. You can't really empathize with the different things. So I think like I feel so lucky that my Rhodes experience was such a protest experience, because I think it really does like throw you into the middle of these particular things are unjust. And they're unjust because these are the ways that this country has been designed. And these are the ways that like my heritage of whiteness have contributed to consistently. And I think that that has consistently eroded an unintentional belief system that was there just because of the structure of my raising. I have pretty liberal parents, very caring parents, always like very open, but just the structure of society was like, I was friends with lots of black and colored kids in my school, but like my parents didn't have any friends that weren't white. Like that didn't exist. That's crazy to me. And it's crazy that that's still a thing in Cape Town, and you go to Joburg and that's not the case. Like we still live in this incredibly racially segregated society in Cape Town. So I positioned myself in that. And I also then, I moved to OBS a year and a bit ago, and it was a really intentional decision also to be in a space where it wasn't just rich and white, because living in Frederick or Cliff Street or whatever it is like more and more rich and white. It feels like, especially with more like kind of neo-colonization from the north, and being able to just be in spaces. And it's been an active process to just try and listen to more stories that I didn't know, read more histories I wasn't aware of, reading about Chris Hani, reading about Steve Biko, trying to just understand the things that I do not understand and did not have a reference point to start understanding. So kind of trying to develop a reference point, and that kind of feeds into the feminist praxis and intersectionality of that. I did my honors at UCT, and part of that was in African gender studies. And then again, just learning from different mechanisms of feminism and where that plants you and how you view it in different ways. And yeah, kind of just trying to listen a lot more than speak, so that I can digest and kind of understand before I'm like in conversation. And I feel very grateful that I get to be around so many different voices that I can listen to. That feels like I feel very grateful for that.
Yeah. So there's often a critique about white feminism. And there's a particular thing that when we all see it, we're like, oh yeah, that's white feminism.
Like people going to space recently.
Like people going to space. Like, yeah, a billionaire's wife going to space. All female space crew kind of thing. Do you encounter that in your work? And how do you deal with that? I mean, I'm assuming you meet people and they would be like, well, I'm a feminist. And you're like, well, I'm also a feminist. And then at some point it's like, okay, but we're talking about different things here. At that point, is there a conversation that goes, well, cool, but like you are one of the people who are celebrating going into space. I mean, that's an extreme example. There are other lesser than going to space examples, like, I don't know, representation on a board or something. We're diverse here because there's now women represented, but they're like all white women, that kind of thing.
I think noting intersectional feminism is one language to what I mean by that way of orienting myself. Another way of speaking about it to me is systems thinking. And to me, it's naive and forms really weak design of anything if you're not going to try and consider a kind of critical mass of all of the parts that contribute into a problem, a challenge, a solution. And so I think I come up against reasonably frequently conversations that are very linear and small-sighted or like narrow-sighted around the way that we see a challenge or a problem. And so I don't think I actually end up in many conversations really in like debates around what kind of feminism, because I do think, as we were talking about earlier, we've exercised the muscle of critique so much that if you are just getting into feminism and that is your first access point, whatever it is, and I might look at that and go, oh, sweet baby feminist, that's not helpful for me if I'm, it's not helpful for that person if I'm that, more than being like, oh, great, so that's what you think. Let's start from there. Like, what other elements do you think form part of the problem? Where else would you see feminism being involved in? Or where else would you see any kind of intersectional practice be relevant? And whenever I'm working on things, I'm always thinking, okay, so can you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of separation away from the thing we're currently talking about? Who's there? What's the ecosystem? What are they doing? What are they saying? What relationships do they hold? What are the different resources that exist? And that, to me, kind of takes a political language out of it, or like an ideological language out of it, and more of a like, if we're dealing with stories, which is often what I'm dealing with and kind of what you two both deal with, is what stories are not getting placed at a table, and then what stories are going to be helpful to hear and to engage and to kind of consolidate and be in a creation process, so that whatever ends up is actually just more resilient, more than it being like the right way of doing it in like a feminist way. So I don't know how, like, that doesn't really answer the question on like my relation of like white feminism in that, but it does help, I think, reduce a bit of charge maybe at times of someone being able to see themselves in a position that doesn't always have to be ideological as much as like, I think, practical. Even though I do consider myself feminist, that will be a hill I will die on. But to kind of make it more accessible, I think it's important to be able to break it down to an orientation that's about diversity of voices and diversity of representation that represents what the world is actually like, instead of where power is held. Because if we're only ever representing where power is held, you're going to keep building things that aren't for the majority. And then like, maybe that is a political orientation, that I'm like, I think everyone should deserve to eat and have good housing. And like, if we keep designing stuff that's not towards that, you're not really showing up for the majority. And so that is, you know, I don't know how much the oligarchy care about that. And maybe the white feminists don't either. Maybe it again is a thing of kind of belonging. Like, I'm happy to do this if it's for me and my people. But like, I don't actually care about Sudan or Congo, whatever it is.
Yeah. That's good. I like the reframing. It's not reframing, but almost like repositioning it for other people. Because some of these things are not supposed to be political, right? Like the idea that everyone should eat is not like a political idea. It's just like survival. It's supposed to be like, well, yeah, we should all eat because we're human beings. But I guess we've made it into political things.
I have a question to ask, but I don't know if this is a problematic question. Please feel free. Please feel free to like shut it down. But I'm just thinking for Tristan and I, obviously we're 2 men, 2 brothers. We have this conversation together, and we are always conscious of the fact that like we 2 men. So for example, in this context, speaking with a woman about what that means and the power and how, you know, systems and society has been set up as well. In terms of the feminist context, and maybe from a desire to be allies or advocates in some way, maybe I shouldn't even be asking this question. I should already know the answer to it. But if I did have to ask a question, like what can we do or how can we be better? Something along those lines. If you're comfortable to answer that or to guide us. And when I say us, I mean us, and also like talking to men in the world, I guess talking to men who are like, we know men are trash, and my wife has this thing that she says,
it's not all men, but it's always a man.
Yeah, it's not all men. And like, we know that, and we're conscious of that. And that's not something that, when I say that, it's not something that I'm pointing, oh yeah, those men. No, I'm include myself in that. I know all of those stories. So yeah, just kind of sitting with that question and wondering if that's even something that I should be asking.
I think so. I mean, I think it's the same thing as my orientation around whiteness. Like, I would give the same answer to you as I would give to myself of can you listen more? Can you be in more spaces where you don't understand and that you're present to listen? I think it's a great question to ask. Maybe I think what's helpful to be in conversation around is that it's kind of hard to empathize if you aren't hearing about someone's lived experience. And I think there's an exhaustion amongst women and then amongst like every other marginalized group of having to speak to their experience again and again and again to elicit enough empathy from whatever the kind of oppressing group is. But I do think that we need more spaces for those conversations, because I think if we turn to like men and feminism, if men are always having to turn to other men to have conversations about how they relate to women, the kind of learning is stuck within an existing kind of persona of understanding and orienting in the world. And I think it's helpful to be able to have conversations that are pretty hard across whatever line it is, like racial, class, whatever it is. Hear the stuff that makes you really, really uncomfortable and decide whether that's not something you actually want to be in conversation about, or like not having to agree with the other side at all times, being able to just listen and start reorienting the way that you relate to the world, because you now have more stories that form part of the bank that guides you. That it's more meta narratives, I suppose, is kind of like you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So as we come to land a little, maybe it'd be good to hear from you your, let's say, like your best imagination or biggest dream for the world and yourself in the world. How would you answer that?
I have something top of mind at the moment, which, like, I don't know if I'm trying to mold it into answering that question or if it is actually relevant to it. But there's a concept that Pumla Kola has like spoken about a lot called the female fear factory. And it's about how there is this manufacturing of fear that exists both because things are happening towards women that are real, but there's also the narrative of the development of fear that keeps people from doing things, because fear is this thing that they're like moving away from, or like it's kind of a control mechanism, fear, in a way. And I think we manufacture fear, and more than just with women. I think it's like South Africa is a really interesting use case for being in this kind of fear factory. Like when I tell people that I walk from home to Woodstock to the studio, everyone's like, that's crazy. Like, is it safe? And I'm like, of course it's safe. Like, I'm walking past a business like literally every 2 meters. Like, but there's something in the orientation around fear that holds us back from doing a lot. And I think when I think of the future I'd like to see one where we're maybe orienting less around fear and orienting more around connection, or being present in social spaces and sharing social spaces. Because I think fear is a really, really, really hectic way that we're being kept away from other parts of society. Because there are narratives of danger, of whatever. Like, you know, you were speaking about Apiwe and Bongeka earlier, and spending time at Timpisa Ratanga, which is like such an incredibly wonderful space. And again, the question of like, that's so crazy. Why would you go to Khayelitsha? And you're like, it's literally people's homes. Like, it's, sure, there are unsafeties, but our inability to step into and take risks, to be in spaces where statistically, you're probably not going to end up in a bad situation if you go to that place or you go to Sikis. Like, I think I'd like to see a world in which we can make fewer decisions based on fear. And that doesn't disregard the fact that there are dangers, there is violence. Women are still, I'm still scared walking on the street for sure. And I should be, there are actual dangers. But where the balancing act maybe of like realistic fear based on stats and a world in which we can do things that are based on an orientation towards something positive rather than a like fear of something negative. And to me that looks like, in like such a basic sense, I have a relationship with all of the neighbors on my part of my street is what I would like that to look like in a like short-term sense, where I run out of this and I can go get it from that person, or that person's kids come and play in my garden every afternoon because they're back from school early, and this kind of sharing of resources and sharing of relationships and sharing, like creating of social fabric. And I think it's quite hard to not, it's quite easy to go super utopian and go, I want to live on a farm and everyone else is on the farm and like we're all making food together.
Distance people, yeah.
And to be honest, like there's a part of me that's like, that's amazing. But I'm also like, I live in an urban context. I love being around, like there's being realistic maybe about that imagination is also important for me, that I would like to eat food that a friend has grown or a neighbor or someone has grown. It is such a joy that I get my eggs from a friend down the road who has chickens. That is like a highlight of my week every week. And it's like such a small thing, but there's kind of access to food systems and access to the core survival needs that we're able to somehow meet more locally or with your neighbors. That also means that there's some kind of collective surveillance that happens where this auntie is watching that part of the street and so kids can play on it despite that their parents aren't home, or that sort of thing. And I'd like to see that being more possible.
I'll be your friend that grows vegetables when I get my farm.
Keen, thank you.
Yeah. I was just thinking of one context. So you were speaking also a lot earlier about the individualistic things and then moving more towards community-oriented things. And I was also thinking about community in the sense of future generations. That's also community. I have some thoughts and theories about how time is not linear and all of these kind of things. Won't go into that. But I also think about that as well. So there are some things that you were talking about and saying like, the utopian things about living on a farm or cool things like that. Like, I am a dreamer and I do like to imagine and be hopeful of a better world, and seeing that come in many ways. Perhaps that's also a dream for future generations as well. So in the now, in the present, the reality of going to Khayelitsha or wherever the space is, but still going there despite that fear, I think about what if we could also imagine a world and be part of creating a world where we don't have any statistics to deal with, where it's an unfair reality or unjust reality that there's humans living in those spaces. For us, it's easier from the suburbs. I'll pop into a space and, but what, like those big dreams and big visions, which, like I said, probably won't come in our lifetime, but thinking of our community as whether any of us in this room have kids or not, but thinking about our descendants in the sense of like humans to come. Also how we can orient ourselves towards creating that better world that we may not see, Tristan. Hopefully you'll see your farm. But if you don't, maybe in 100 years' time, there'll be a version of Tristan, whatever, who will see those beautiful spaces and see those things realized.
Kind of the radical imagination of it that takes you like so far beyond what we can be practical about. I like, maybe in a like radical sense, I'd like to be able to see a world in which any two people could sit at a table and be able to have a conversation. And that's kind of it. It's kind of, because I think that in itself is such a good little microcosm of what we're quite incapable of doing at times. We've like built up so much capacity to others, and you don't need to belong with that person. You don't need to like them even. That's fine to have opposing beliefs, but there's like something to me in like a radical imagination that if you're just able to sit and have a conversation and recognize the humanity of the person on the other side of the table, there's some interpersonal growth and shifts in consciousness that have happened in each of those individuals to make that possible. And I wonder if from that changes our orientation towards violence in a different way. And maybe that has to scale, because it has to be then in groups. You can sit across another group because your groupthink mind is a different thing from an individual mind and conversation. And what if you build that out and out and out? Does that look like neighbors able to have a more civil conversation if they're like a little bit upset about something, and it doesn't end up with the police being called when someone's having a noisy evening or whatever? And hopefully what that looks like more than that. And I think this is not an interpersonal thing, but if we're able to have systems that are not extractive and exploitative, I think we do end up with social dynamics and spaces where statistics of violence are less, because your survival needs are more covered. Like I think about like a world in which UBI happens, universal basic income. What does that look like? What does it look like for people to have their basic needs met? And what does that then create for what they have access to? And like, you know, we can't really take away the fact that like people have lived on land in 1,000 years ago, and if they saw someone else, they did consider them a threat, and sometimes they didn't. And they're different societies and civilizations that have gone to war or gone into negotiation and shared or not. So I'm not gonna radically imagine a space in which everyone's like hunky-dory happy, because I don't think that is honest, in my opinion, about how we are. But that we maybe just have more capacity to see and experience and shake hands with someone else, and then be like, well, I might not agree with you, but that doesn't mean I have to be like violent towards you or take something from you.
Yeah, it's almost like the world that we've built now doesn't have what it takes to give us that you've described, because everything has been set up so that we can live a very individual life. Like everything's been set up so we don't depend on other people. Like the wealth, especially the wealthier you get, actually you just depend on yourself and your money. You don't have to go to the neighbor because you're not going to run out of stuff. And you don't need to know where your food comes from because you just go to the shop. And I mean, even like security, instead of like knowing the people around you, you'd hire the extreme case, you have like a guard there with privacy, all that kind of stuff. And so I feel like what's happening in the world is like a return to a more communal, or at least a yearning for a more communal kind of thing. Maybe younger people are doing that more, recognizing that that's also part of being a human being, is like we do need one another. We can't be a human being by ourselves, you know.
And like you said, it is a big reason why we've also got more cults and things, which is, it's just interesting that kind of there's this move towards more communal living, but then there's also a learning that kind of needs to happen about what the kind of boundaries of that organism look like, and how insular it is, and how you create bridges from that it's more about modular communities than isolated communities, which kind of feels like to me, maybe this has happened before, but to me that kind of seems like a really healthy focus on an evolution as a society and as humanity, that if we can learn to be in community and connected, that those walls are more open. They're maybe like picket fences rather than Johannesburg walls.
Johannesburg walls. All love to Joburg people.
Yeah, big love to Joburg people.
Well, thank you, Leila, for coming. This has been a great conversation.
Big pleasure. Thank you. That was really, really enjoyable.
Thank you so much. It's such a vibe. I wasn't lying when I said she's a vibe.